Hey guys, Matt here. Today we're continuing our study through the book of Hebrews. We're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. And if you are someone who is feeling stressed out, worn out, anxious, burdened, this text, I believe, is going to be a huge encouragement to you. So make sure that you watch all the way to the end. We're going to start by reading our passage, then we're going to go back to the beginning and we're going to unpack it. So Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, "As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest," although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, "And God rested on the seventh day from all his works." And again, in this passage, he said, "They shall not enter my rest." Since, therefore, it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, in the words already quoted, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. All right, so let's start at the very beginning. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. It says, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened." Now, the first thing I want to point out is at the very beginning of verse 1, we have a therefore. And that therefore is connecting us back to the end of chapter 3, which was focusing on the Israelites who were coming out of the Exodus, but who were unable to enter into the promised land because of their unbelief. So they did not enter into God's rest in the promised land because they did not have faith. They were not trusting in him. So that is the context that is framing the beginning of chapter 4. And it says, the promise of entering his rest still stands for us. So it says, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. So the question is, what type of fear should we be having? Well, again, the context is dealing with unbelief. So this fear that we should have should be a healthy fear of falling into unbelief. For a Christian, to have faith really means to trust in God, to put our trust in him. And we need to make sure that we are always very intentional and focused and have a healthy fear of falling into that unbelief. So we want to be focused on having belief, right? We want to be focused on trusting in God, which is why the end of chapter 3, it was saying, today, don't harden your hearts. Today, encourage one another that you would be trusting in him, that you would not fall into unbelief. And it even says that in verse 2. It says, the message they heard, the Israelites, did not benefit them because they were not united by faith. So they had unbelief. So we need to make sure that we have a healthy fear of falling into unbelief. We need to be trusting in God. We need to be believing and having faith in him at all times, every single day. Now we're going to look at verses 3 through 9. And I know sometimes you see the logic or the flow of thought for some of these writers, and you're like, I'm not really sure where they're going, what they're trying to connect this with this, and it can get a little bit confusing, but hopefully I'll be able to lay it out to you pretty plainly, and it'll make sense. It's a really beautiful truth. So let's look at verses 3 through 9. It says, "For we who have believed entered that rest, as he has said, 'As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest,' although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, 'And God rested on the seventh day from all his works.' And again in this passage he said, 'They shall not enter my rest.' Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, 'Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts.' For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God." So one thing that we see multiple times in that one little clip that we just looked at is that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So this rest that we're talking about was not just for the Israelites back in the Old Testament. It was not just for the people who were about to enter into the promised land. There remains a rest for us today. And in fact, in verse 8, it said, "For if Joshua had given them rest," now Joshua was the leader who led the Israelites into the promised land. If you remember, Moses passed away because of his sin, and he was not able to lead the people into the promised land. That was Joshua. And it says, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. And that is referencing Psalm 95, which was quoted in this passage, where it speaks of a rest for the people of God. So it's saying the ultimate rest did not terminate with the people of Israel. There is a rest that is available for us today. And that is an absolutely beautiful truth. And one of the ways that the author of Hebrews is showing that this Sabbath rest still remains is by taking us back to creation. Because in the creation account, we know that God created for 6 days, and it says on the seventh day, he rested from his works. Now, here's something that's really interesting, and hopefully let's not get into semantics. I think you'll understand what I'm saying here. Some theologians will say, well, did God really rest on the seventh day? Well, in a sense, yes. In a sense, no. No, in the sense that he was still upholding the world. So it's not like he wasn't doing any work. I mean, he was upholding the world. He was still doing things. But yes, he stopped creating in the way that he had been creating for the 6 days. And what we see is that on the seventh day, you can, in a sense, say he created, again, don't get caught up in the semantics, a Sabbath rest. So he was introducing this Sabbath rest to the people. And what we see is that Sabbath rest is still available to us. So you could say through the creation account, God is giving us some sort of knowledge about how he works, but specifically, he is giving us knowledge about how salvation works. So when we look back to creation, we see work for 6 days. And on the seventh day, he rested. And so that rest, Sabbath rest, is available for us. And now we are going to see the nature of the Sabbath rest. And this is where I think you're going to get a huge blessing and a huge benefit in verse 10. It says, "For whoever has entered God's rest," and remember, we do that through faith, "has also rested from his works as God did from his." So remember, in creation, God works for 6 days and then he rests. That is actually a beautiful picture and a model for us to follow. God rested from his works, and we as true Christians and true believers, we rest from our works, and that's how we enter into his works. Now, somebody may hear that and they may say, "Matt, what are you saying? Are you saying that Christians don't have to obey God's laws and they don't have to do good things? They don't have to act righteously?" No, as a Christian, we should do the right thing. We should have good deeds and good behavior. But those things are fruits of our salvation. They are not what cause our salvation. The cause of our salvation is simply trusting in the finished work of Christ. That is how we are justified. And so that is the sense in which we are resting from our works. We understand it's not our good deeds, it's not our behavior, it's not our obedience that somehow merits salvation for us. We understand that we are justified solely by the grace of God and the finished work of Jesus Christ upon the cross. And we trust in that alone for salvation. We're not trusting in his work plus my works. No, it is only his works. And in fact, look at this. I want to look at just one passage. This is from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So Jesus says he has a yoke, but his yoke is easy. Now you might wonder, well, what is that yoke? Jesus was once asked, "What must we do to do the works that the Father requires?" And Jesus answered that that work was to believe. That is why his yoke is easy and his burden is light. He says, you want to get salvation? It's different than the way that the Pharisees were telling you. They're saying you have to keep the law perfectly and you have to do this purification right and you got to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and this. And if you do enough good things, maybe you can get to heaven. And Jesus says, you want to know what you actually have to do? Believe. Believe in me. Trust in me. Guys, This should make us just take a deep breath, exhale, and have so much peace. Like I said before, if you are anxious, if you are burdened, if you are feeling weighed down because I don't live up to God's standard. Well, hey, join the club. None of us live up to God's standard, but I can still have this peace because I have entered into God's Sabbath rest, where I am not trusting in my own good deeds for salvation. I am trusting in Him, and that gives me peace and rest because I know that Jesus was perfect. He perfectly fulfilled the law. And so my confidence in salvation is in Him, and He is perfect and does not change. So I can have complete confidence in Him. I know my good deeds are not going to get me to heaven. And so while, yes, I can feel conviction over my sin, and that is good and appropriate, and we do not use this as a license to sin, but rather as a response to God's amazing grace, we are driven towards obedience. I absolutely can have that Sabbath rest. I don't have to have the pressure of the world upon me, thinking that if I have one sin or one mistake, then I'm somehow going to slip out of God's hand. I'm going to lose my salvation. No, I trust in Him. This is a beautiful rest into which we can enter. Friends, I hope that you will meditate on this truth. I hope that it is a blessing to you in your walk with Christ. We're going to continue on, Lord willing, with our study through the book of Hebrews with a video every Friday. I also do some discernment work on Mondays and Wednesdays, so be sure to subscribe to my channel if you have not done so already. Hopefully it will be a blessing to you and it will help me to get this content out to more people on YouTube. But that's it for our video today, guys. Thanks for watching, and until next time, God bless.